On the Friday after Thanksgiving in 1950, the sky over the Carolinas began to do something the Weather Bureau had no real name for yet. There was no satellite watching it form. There was no computer model predicting where it would go. There was only a forecaster in Washington looking at a hand-drawn map, watching the pressure readings coming in from stations across the east, and slowly realizing that the numbers did not look like anything in the record books. By the time it was over, 6 days later, it would be remembered as the storm of the century. Snow drifts 25 feet deep. Wind gusts of 160 miles an hour. 1 million homes without power in the bitter cold. Over 160 confirmed deaths, with some later estimates running considerably higher once flooding and exposure deaths across the whole region were counted. And an entire stretch of the country, from West Virginia to New England, brought completely to a standstill by a single storm that arrived without warning in the last days of November 1950. This is the story of the Great Appalachian Storm. The trouble began on November 24th, the day after Thanksgiving. A sharp Arctic cold front had already dropped temperatures across eastern Kentucky into the single digits, with more cold pouring in behind it. Down over the Carolinas, a low-pressure system began to form along that same front, the kind of ordinary autumn disturbance that meteorologists saw dozens of times every year and rarely thought twice about. This one did not behave like the others. Instead of following the normal path up the east coast and out to sea, the storm turned inland. It tracked north and west, straight toward the mountains, pulled by a blocking ridge of high pressure parked over eastern Canada that left it nowhere else to go. By the evening of November 25th, the storm had planted itself almost directly over Ohio. And there it stayed, spinning in place for days, drawing in cold Arctic air on one side and warm moist air off the Atlantic on the other, the two colliding directly over the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. Meteorologists today, looking back at the data, understand exactly why this combination was so violent. The temperature difference between the cold and warm air masses feeding into the storm was extreme, and the storm's slow, looping, almost stationary path meant that instead of moving through one region and out to the next, it simply sat over the same unlucky stretch of country for days, pouring snow and wind and rain onto the same towns again and again. In Pittsburgh, the snow started falling on the 24th and did not meaningfully stop for the better part of 3 days. By the time it finally tapered off, the city had received 30.5 inches. Steubenville, Ohio, recorded 44 inches. Youngstown and Erie both passed 28, and in the mountains of West Virginia, where the terrain wrung every last drop of moisture out of the storm, the numbers became almost impossible to believe. Pickens, West Virginia, reported 57 inches. Coburn Creek, West Virginia, recorded 63.2 inches of snow, a state record that has never been broken since. 63 inches is over 5 feet. Snow that deep did not just cover the ground. It buried cars up to their roof lines. It buried the first-floor windows of houses. Drifts, pushed by ferocious winds, piled up to 25 feet in sheltered spots, tall enough to bury a 2-story building entirely. We think of the great blizzards of American memory, the ones that get talked about generation after generation, and this storm belongs in exactly that company, even though far fewer people today know its name. The cold arriving with the storm was its own separate danger. Temperatures across the region fell into the single digits and stayed there through the worst of the snowfall, turning ordinary exposure into a life-threatening situation in a matter of minutes for anyone caught outside. Families who lost heat when the power failed had almost no way to warm their homes. Coal, the fuel that heated most houses in this part of the country in 1950, could not be delivered on roads that had disappeared under drifts taller than a man. Some families burned furniture. Some simply gathered every blanket in the house and huddled together in one room, waiting. While the mountains were being buried in snow, A completely different disaster was unfolding along the coast. On the eastern side of the storm, where the air was warmer, the same enormous pressure gradient that was dumping snow on Pittsburgh was generating wind speeds that belonged more to a hurricane than a winter storm. New York City recorded a wind gust of 94 miles an hour. Newark, New Jersey recorded 108. At Bear Mountain, just north of New York City, a gust of 140 miles an hour was measured. And at the summit of Mount Washington in New Hampshire, already famous for having recorded some of the most extreme winds ever measured anywhere on Earth, the storm produced a gust of 160 miles an hour. These were not blizzard winds. These were hurricane-force winds, and in some cases stronger than many hurricanes ever produce, driven by a storm that the public had been told to expect nothing more than rain and cold from. Along the coastline of New Jersey and Connecticut, the wind driving in off the Atlantic combined with unusually high tides to push seawater over beaches, boardwalks, and low-lying roads. Dikes protecting LaGuardia Airport in New York were breached, flooding the runways and shutting the airport down completely at the height of the busy Thanksgiving travel weekend, stranding thousands of passengers with nowhere to go and no way to get there. Trees came down by the tens of thousands across New England, taking power lines with them. In town after town, the wind simply outmatched the electrical infrastructure the country had built, snapping poles and tearing down lines faster than any crew could repair them. Estimates from the time suggested well over 1 million homes across the affected region lost power during the worst of the storm, many of them for the better part of a week. Imagine that combination for a moment. A blizzard burying the mountains under 5 feet of snow at the exact same time a hurricane-force windstorm was tearing apart the coast 300 miles away, both driven by the very same slow-moving low-pressure system parked over Ohio. It is genuinely difficult to find another storm in American history that produced 2 such different, equally catastrophic weather events at once, in the same week, from the same source. Travel simply stopped. Roads across West Virginia, western Pennsylvania, and eastern Ohio became completely impassable, some of them staying that way for the better part of a week. This was 1950. There were no fleets of modern snowplows standing ready. There was no interstate highway system yet. No salt trucks running through the night. None of the infrastructure that a modern winter storm response depends on. Local road crews did what they could with what they had. But in many rural stretches of Appalachia, the honest answer was that nothing could move at all until the snow simply melted or was shoveled away by hand, one driveway and one road at a time. In Cleveland, the Ohio National Guard was called out, and soldiers from the 112th Engineers spent days working alongside city crews, shoveling snowbound streets by hand in a city that had never seen anything remotely like this. Photographs from that week show buses abandoned mid-route, buried nearly to their windows. They show men standing chest-deep in drifts that had swallowed entire parked cars overnight. They show streets that had simply ceased to be streets, transformed instead into featureless white corridors between the buildings. Families trapped in remote parts of the mountains faced the most serious danger of all. With roads impassable and phone lines down across huge stretches of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, there was often no way to call for help and no way for help to reach you even if you managed to call. People died from exposure in homes that had lost heat. People died from hypothermia after becoming stranded in cars that had slid off roads already invisible beneath the snow. People died attempting to walk for help through conditions that made walking any real distance essentially a fight for your life. The death toll compiled in the storm's immediate aftermath stood at 160, a number still cited by federal weather agencies today as the storm's confirmed toll. Some contemporary newspaper accounts and later regional tallies, counting flooding deaths and exposure-related deaths across the full breadth of the affected states, put the total considerably higher, into the several hundreds. The uncertainty itself tells you something about how chaotic those final days of November 1950 actually were. In parts of the country, it took weeks simply to determine who exactly had been lost. And then, just as the region began to dig itself out, a second disaster arrived on the heels of the first. In the first week of December, temperatures across the eastern half of the country swung sharply upward, well above normal for the season. All that snow, 5 feet of it in places, began melting rapidly, and rapid snowmelt on already saturated ground has nowhere to go but into the rivers. The Ohio River at Pittsburgh rose to 28.5 feet, 4 feet above flood stage. In Cincinnati, the river climbed to 56 feet, also 4 feet above flood stage. Towns that had just spent a week shoveling themselves out from under a historic blizzard now found water rising in their streets and basements, a bitter, almost unbelievable coda to a storm that had already taken nearly everything it could from them. When the National Centers for Environmental Information later analyzed every major winter storm to strike the Ohio Valley going back over a century using a standardized measurement called the Regional Snowfall Index, the Great Appalachian Storm of 1950 came out on top. Not near the top. At the very top. Its index value of nearly 35 stands well clear of the second-place storm, one that struck in 1993, over 4 decades later. Only 3 other storms in more than 100 years of Ohio Valley weather history have ever reached the same top category this storm achieved. In the Northeast, where the storm's winds, rather than its snow, did the worst damage, it still ranks among the 10 most extreme storms ever recorded for that region as well. At the time, insurance companies paid out more money to policyholders for damage from this single storm than they had ever paid out for any hurricane or storm before it in American history. The final damage estimate came to $66 million, an extraordinary sum in 1950 dollars, for a storm that most Americans today have simply never heard of. Ask someone about the blizzard of 1888, the Great White Hurricane that shut down New York for a week, and many people will know something about it. Ask about the legendary blizzards of the late 1970s that shut down the Midwest and the Northeast, and an entire generation remembers them vividly, some of them personally. But the Great Appalachian Storm of 1950, which by nearly every meteorological measure available was worse than both of them for the region. It struck hardest, has largely faded from the national memory, remembered clearly now mostly by the people who actually lived through it, and by the meteorologists who still study it as the benchmark against which every other Ohio Valley winter storm is measured. If you were there, if your family has ever told the story of that Thanksgiving week in 1950, the drifts taller than the house, the National Guard shoveling out Cleveland, a coal delivery that never came, leave a comment and start it with the word blizzard. Tell us what you remember or what was passed down to you. Other people will not know why you started with that word, but we will. Thanks for taking this trip down memory lane with us. We will see you in the next one.